Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court and CPS issues. I'm your host, Marion Petrie, and today I have a guest from Canada, and her name is Trish Guise. And Trish Guise has an MBA. She is a high conflict divorce strategist and a new ways for families coach, trained by Bill Eddy, co-founder of the High Conflict Institute. Trish is also the Canadian ambassador for the new publication Contemporary Family, which provides practical knowledge for improving outcomes for children when parents separate. This publication provides timely research and professional guidance from specialists in psychology, family law, education, health, case management, and child and family services. Trish has over 20 years experience as coaching and training entrepreneurs, corporate employees, and post-secondary students in communication and conflict resolution skills. After experiencing her own high conflict divorce and parental alienation, Trish now counsels parents on how to communicate with their high conflict ex-spouse while protecting themselves and their children from abuse and alienation. Working in conjunction with researchers and advocates, lawyers, psychologists, and social workers, Trish hopes to see significant changes in how the law protects children from alienation. Trish is one of the Universal Women's Network Women of Inspiration and will be featured in the 100 Women of Inspiration book coming out this fall, and will be featured on Cross Canada Tour commencing on March 8th, 2021, International Women's Day. So I have a very special guest here, and welcome, Trish. How is your day going?
Great. Thank you, Marianne, and thanks for having me.
Definitely. You've done a lot of work.
Yes.
So when did you start your, counseling parents on how to communicate with their high conflict spouse that won't cooperate?
Right. It's a fairly new practice. I started end of last year, and it's sort of evolving. It was something that I've been thinking about for quite some time and trying to amalgamate everything that I have learned. And something that always had bothered me was knowing how hard it was for me despite the support system that I had, and also knowing there are so many families out there that did not have the same support. And it's great to have resources online and whatnot, but if you don't have certain guidance, it can be devastating, and things could be much worse than you realize, and it can affect your entire life. And so I thought, I need to take this information and do something with it to help other families.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great because there's really not a lot of guidance. We have co-parent counseling, but that's usually court ordered. And some parents don't even cooperate with that. And, I feel the judge should know. I mean, if it's being court ordered and a parent walks out, shouldn't the judge know about that? Do you call the judge? Do you do any of that if someone is not cooperating?
Do I personally, or do I suggest that to the client?
Both.
Yeah, I definitely am a strong believer in not giving too many chances. I think what we do, especially as parents who tend to be, the erased parents or parents that are trying hard to comply with the court orders and struggling with the other parent, we often think, okay, it's just this one time, or we don't want to stir up any more conflict, and we keep giving them chances, as does the system. I don't believe we should be doing that. I feel the first transgression, we should be addressing it with the judge. In Canada, or at least in Alberta, we have cases. And so we have a case conference, and we also have people who kind of navigate us through that. And you need to address it through that process, because oftentimes the courts give a lot of chances. So if you're giving them 3 chances and then the court gives 3 chances, you could be looking 6 months down the road, a year down the road, as you know, and it gets worse and worse. And we need to nip it in the bud, because we need to start taking these court orders seriously, even if we have to bring it down to the fact that these are contracts. If this was in corporate law, not many corporations would give people 3, 6, 10 chances to follow the contract. We need to start doing this because there are little minds and and people behind this, families and children behind this. It's extremely important. We need to start taking it more seriously.
Right. And I've noticed that, oh, well, since you're from Canada and I'm from the United States, it just seems like these judges are not holding anyone accountable if they don't follow through with seeing a co-parent counselor or family counseling or whatever they've been ordered. It'll just be a slap on the wrist, and then they're just moving on to the next topic.
Yes. Yeah, I find, and I can't speak for the judges themselves. I'd love the opportunity to actually speak to a few judges and say, what's the thought process here? Because to be fair, I think where they're sitting is they're asked to make decisions that are really difficult. First, depending on how the evidence is presented, it can be a he said, she said, and that's where my job comes in, where I want to counsel the parent to bring forth the most salient and the strongest evidence so that you can have the judge look at this. Because these judges, as well as lawyers, they're not psychologists. They're not trained in this. What they need is a guidance system as to if these people transgress and let's say they're not allowing their child to go see the other parent based on the court order, what is the best remedy here? On the one hand, you can look at punitive measures, but also despite that, I think that's important because what I find is, and what we find is that people who don't follow court orders, like if you think about that for a second, they're not following a court order that a judge has imposed. So if you're not afraid of the ramifications of what a judge imposes, I'm not so sure what you're afraid of. So there needs to be, people like that need to have consequences. If you're a high conflict individual, personality disordered, you often will do whatever you want to do unless there is a severe consequence. So there's that aspect. But then there's the aspect of how do we make sure that the children are safe and that what is happening is in their best interest. And I don't think there's a lot of guidance in that. So when there's alienation, let's say, judges still aren't sure what the remedy should be. And, the jury's out on that too, it seems like, out in the psychological world. So I think there needs to be a lot more work done that way so we can guide the judges in exactly what needs to be done.
I know our judges have to have, like continuing education. I'm sure yours do too, but it doesn't seem like it's a it doesn't seem like they're learning from it. I'm sorry, I have to come out and say it. They're just doing their own thing.
Well, and that's the thing, based on my limited research in that as far as I understand, judges, there is continuing education for judges, but it is up to their discretion. So I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a huge push for education, not only on what the possible remedies are, but I think more importantly, I think we need to start bringing them back to stop compartmentalizing so much and start looking at there is a family behind this. These are children who will become future citizens that will impact the rest of society. And if we want to stop having so many opioid overdoses and things like that, we need to start looking at where this is coming from and actually start paying attention to it and look at, one of the things I think would be so invaluable would be for there to be a feedback system so that just like doctors do when there's a patient that is died under their watch, they do an M&M and morbidity and mortality conference to determine were there mistakes made, not as a punitive measure, but in terms of so they, as well as their colleagues, can learn from mistakes, whether they were systemic or education-based or what have you. To my knowledge, there isn't that system in the judicial system, and there should be, so that judges understand the choices they're making, ill-informed or well-informed, how is that truly impacting these families? Just because they don't see them back in the court system doesn't mean anything. That could mean they've given up. That could mean they've lost faith in the system, which happens so often. Could mean that some of these poor parents have spent their last dollar, or they just don't have it in them anymore. And that is such a shame. And I think that's where we need to start looking at, if you take pride in your work, you need to, in any field, you need to do, find out what your KPIs are and determine whether or not you're adhering to them and if you're actually making a difference, as opposed to just simply making a decision and not caring about what the ramifications or the results are.
Right. And your job, when you just see one parent at a time, just only
Correct.
one, you don't see them together. So have you ever had a parent that was just, you could tell was uncooperative? Anything you've asked them, they just got snappy with you?
No, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not too sure because I would like to work with people like that, but I haven't yet. But there have been cases where the people who are generally cooperative, but are very resistant to doing certain things. And so what I tried to do is, instead of getting them to see the value of this course of action that I've suggested, start looking at why the resistance and talking about, what are the issues here? Because I think the more you push someone forward, the more they're going to resist. And perhaps and I found that oftentimes we talk about things and it's all fear-based, and understandably so. They don't even realize they're fearful. I myself, when I went through it, didn't realize, we couldn't understand even simple things. This is a silly example, but we were on an amusement ride in Universal Studios, and I get terrified in some of these things, but I burst into tears and I didn't like it. And I used to love rides like that, but I had no idea it was because of all the trauma that I'd been through. And that's what we're finding too with a lot of these clients that I work with, that they're not able to make some beneficial decisions based on either some trauma or some issues they have. So we need to deal with that first, and then they can start making the proper decisions for themselves and their families.
Mm-hmm. Have you had patients that you've seen for, I don't know how long that you see these patients? Like you said, sometimes they run out of money, or, but do you have cases that run long?
Well, again, because I'm new to the practice, so I can't say that I've been with people for a long time, but I envision a couple of things. I mean, ultimately, people say this all the time. It's very cliche. It'd be great to work yourself out of a job, because then they're on their own. And it depends on why I'd be working with someone. In some cases, it's simply just to get through the legal process, whether it's preparing them to communicate with their lawyer, or just to get through that process, or do a parenting plan. Other cases, it's more long-term, because having to work with, how do I now become a single parent? How do I balance that with my life? Or for that matter, even I think where I'd work the longest with people is people who are either noticing signs of alienation or in the midst of it, because then there's a lot of work to do. It's a matter of, how do you communicate with your child? How do you work the legal system to get that relationship back? But also, to me, almost more importantly, because it's the basis of it, is how do you stay yourself? How do you not lose yourself in this process? Because it can become all consuming. And how do you also maintain hope? Not false hope and not Pollyanna type hope, but how do you put one step in front of the other to forward yourself, regardless of what is happening with your children? That has to be a separate thing, because I find we often just focus so much on that, because it's such a huge part of our lives, that at the end of it all, regardless of the result, we're kind of standing in this open field and we don't know where to go now. And that's really hard. It's almost like starting from scratch, like saying, it's like I was in my 20s, but now I'm in my 50s, and it can be very debilitating.
Mm-hmm.
So with people like that, I try to work, I envision working a long time, but it could be much longer than others, because you want to keep them on track, and it's a very difficult process sometimes to dig yourself out of that.
Mm-hmm. Do you find the parents that like are fresh out of family court, do you find that they've got pressured speech? They have a hard time collecting their thoughts?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that going into court for whatever reason isn't a traumatic process. I don't care whether you so-called win or lose. It is terrifying,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing is that you could be 100% right within the law, and you still don't know what the results will be. It's no different, I guess, than going into surgery, but you're placing essentially your entire life and your family's well-being in one person's hands. So and plus, if you've been through the trauma of a high conflict divorce, it feels like, everyday life, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. So you are in heightened arousal all the time and constantly jumping. So to be able to pull your thoughts together in a cohesive way is extremely difficult. That also is traumatizing for people, because then people get labeled as, they're a little too emotional. Maybe they're not all there, not realizing that's a total trauma response, and is so normal. And instead of judging that and penalizing people for that, doesn't mean they're less of a parent. It just means they need some care in kind of undoing all that damage, because it is damaging. It's damaging for children and for parents.
Yeah, most definitely. Do you have parents that come in and talk to you and say, well, 2 weeks ago my kid liked me and now they don't, and they're swearing at me and whatever the situation may be. Y- y- how long? Well, I guess I was going to say, how long does that take to fix? You know?
Well, it's interesting too, because I feel like that kind of thing happens all the time in intact families, but it's so much more heightened when we're in a separated family or a divorced family, because one always wonders, we always wonder, where's this coming from? But usually in an intact family, you don't wonder if the other parent had a hand in this. But when we're separated or divorced, often we think that, and sometimes it's the case, and sometimes it's truly a child's response to the trauma of having to move from home to home, and they're very resentful. And I find that with proper counseling for the child, I'm a big believer in, I don't care how well your divorce is going, that children need to have that support away from mom and dad to talk freely about what's going on, because we ask a lot of our children and it's difficult for us. And what I found, and psychologists tend to say too, that if you're receiving that from your child, it's not to say that's okay, but in a way it's, I don't want to say compliment, but they do that usually only in their safe zone. So you're the safe parent where they can feel free with their emotions. And because if they do that with the other parent, there'd be a lot of trouble, and they're having to process a lot of information. But as a parent, that's so difficult because you're doing your best and there's a lot of hurt behind that, whether you're intact family or not. And it's when you have been traumatized as a parent, I find when you receive reactions like that from your children, that just intensifies it and starts to make you question your ability to parent. Am I doing the right thing? And you're constantly second guessing yourself, which is so difficult.
Mhm. Now, do you think some of these judges contribute to the alienation of, in their court orders? Like some will write no contact until the age of 18, or no contact via iPad, landline, or even holidays. And what are these parents supposed to do and handle that?
I will never understand why decisions like that are made. It doesn't matter what country or whatever, because let's say in Canada, if you look at the foster care system, for instance, when a child is removed based on proven abuse, I've seen it myself in many cases where there is still that focus to get help for the parent, because the ultimate result, what they want to have happen, is to return the child to the family. So they're in temporary care, but they focus and they make sure there's enough help for that parent to resolve their issues, to make sure it's safe. But in the meantime, as long as it's safe, they do everything possible to make sure that the ties that bind are still there, so that they still have visits, supervised, whatever. I don't quite understand why that doesn't transfer into the divorce courts, because nowhere does it say, research shows that it is best for the children to have a relationship with both parents regardless. And if there is true abuse, I don't know why we're not dealing with that. I can't understand, like a lot of the cases I read about or come across, when a judge makes that ruling, it's often, I can't find evidence of abuse. It's just allegations. And so I don't understand how we can make rulings like that, knowing full well the guarantee of damage given to that child later on. That's one thing we can guarantee. If they don't have a relationship with a parent, especially in cases where there isn't abuse and there's no reason, they will have lifelong effects. And I don't think judges are quite understanding that yet, because then I can't imagine them making those rulings.
I have found, and what I've I've talked to other parents, and it seems like some of these judges and attorneys, there are relationships between them, and some of them will argue in front of a judge and some of them won't argue,
Hmm.
and they'll find an underling to do it, or I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of hopping, skipping, and jumping, and in my opinion, it's like a corrupt system that is perpetuating the parental alienation.
Well, absolutely. In a case like that where, you go into the system, none of us know the law when we first go into this. We don't ever anticipate this. So you put a lot of faith in the professional you've hired as the lawyer to be ethical, to do their job, but also be ethical. I've never once had going into it, I never thought I'd have to question the ethics or the morality. You just assume. Same with judges. And I know when you and I have spoken previously about that, it's a little different in Canada in terms of the overt corruption. Perhaps because in the States, to my understanding, the judges are elected.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to, just like anything, right, there have to be those partnerships between people in order to get the certain amount of votes you need. We don't have that in Canada. They are appointed by government bodies. That's not to say, though, that there aren't certain alliances, I'm sure, but it's not nearly as overt. That I don't know of any overt findings of corruption in that, in which you're talking about, where there are those relationships, or the old boys network where they're hanging out. There's very much a separation between judges and lawyers. So for instance, all the judges are first lawyers and they're in certain firms. Once they become judges, and if anyone from their firm is standing before them, there is, I know I've, in my own personal case, have to sign off and have another judge appointed, because there could be a conflict of interest because they used to work at that firm, or if they were my previous lawyer or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But doesn't mean to say that there isn't, corruption can mean a lot of things. And that bothers me that there is that level of corruption in the States, because again, we're forgetting about, why are they there? They are there to protect children. It's as simple as that. But you see it in the foster care system. You see it everywhere. It's so easy to compartmentalize and forget who you're doing this for, and forget there's a face at the end of it all. And I'm not a believer at all to bringing children into the courtroom, but I feel like we almost have to personalize things a bit more to remind people we're not just talking houses and money, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems so easy for the courts to say to a parent, no, you can't contact them, which I don't frankly understand how that's damaging at all. You can't contact them, you can't see them. So effectively taking your child away from you for no good reason. Nowhere in the world would a judge ever do that if they felt you weren't taking care of your home properly. They would never remove your home from your possession, but yet it seems so easy to do that for a child, and people are starting to accept that and thinking, well, if there's smoke, there's fire. And I think that is ludicrous. There has to be more of an uprising, because this is so wrong. Not only is it damaging, but it's just plain wrong.
And so many parents are suffering from it, as well as the children.
Right.
But some of these kids are compartmentalizing, and I don't know, like, how many children do you counsel,
I
or
don't
none?
counsel.
Just adults?
No, just adults. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
something, working with children is a highly specialized
Mm-hmm.
area. And, I encourage parents to spend a lot of time researching and even interviewing psychologists that are going to be working with your children. They need to be very trauma informed. I mean, there's a lot of great counselors and psychologists out there, but really need to, I don't know if they necessarily need to be highly experienced in terms of alienation. That would be helpful, but there's not a lot out there. But that's not something I would work in, because that's not where my expertise lies, because there's so much involved in that, and you have to be able to ascertain, be able to screen for violence and abuse and that kind of thing too. So I think it's key. Every child should have counseling. That should be mandated for sure.
Right, exactly. Even going through the divorce process, the separation divorce, they should be put into counseling, and with family counseling as well, so
Yes.
they have the emotional support of both parents. But sometimes that's just not happening. And I'm sure you've had a parent sit there in front of you and say, this other parent will not cooperate with anything. You can't
Yes.
reason with them.
Yes.
And
Go
dare
ahead.
we say narcissist when you're dealing with someone, I know. do we just come out and say, what do you do with these people?
Right, right. And oftentimes the case, I know people are very reluctant to call them that. And sure, they're not necessarily diagnosed, but the tendencies are there. You call it what you want. But when a person is told point blank, this is what's best for your child, a normal parent, in my opinion, would do whatever it takes to go to the ends of the earth to protect their child, regardless of how it is for us, how difficult it is for us. To me, it's a pretty simple test. If you're not willing to do what it takes to protect your child when science has proven this is what's best, I have an issue with that. In my experience, forcing the high conflict individual, the narcissist or what have you, to be in family counseling typically doesn't work, because either A, they will say what needs to be said in order to look good, but then will leave the office and continue their same behavior. Or they will, which is very traumatizing for the child and confusing as well as for the other parent, or they will continue to be abusive in a sanctioned environment like that. And if it's not controlled by the counselor, the therapist, or the psychologist, that's damaging too. We're just giving them another arena to perhaps woo the therapist, and hopefully they're not fooled by him, but they're very good at what they do. Even the most intelligent people, the most trained people, and it's not a criticism. It is easy to get fooled by them. They're much better at lying than we are at all at telling the truth. It's as simple as that. So what I would say is the best thing for them is for that other parent to get their own counseling, the child, and then counseling with the child and the parent, because what you need to do then is strengthen the bond between that parent and that child, so that that child has a safe place to go to no matter what. And no matter what is said, I can't guarantee that it'll prevent alienation. I don't think anyone can guarantee that, because sometimes these people are very motivated, but at least you're doing everything you can, irrespective of what that individual is doing, to maintain that bond between you and your child.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a parent and a child and you're counseling them, and the child is just, I mean, have you ever seen just an angry child that just wants to get out of the counseling with the parent?
Yes. And what I find is, and anger is a normal emotion. I find that so often when we see that, especially in our children, the tendency is to back away and, oh, we need to avoid this. This is not good. I think we need to be a lot more respectful and encouraging of emotions, because we don't want our children to grow up pushing those emotions down, because that surfaces somewhere else, right? This is a safe place where what is important is to have whoever's working with them, a counselor, therapist, coach, to make sure they validate that and kind of investigate as to where that's coming from, right? If it's just going to be a event session, that's not, in my opinion, is not helpful. You can still validate, but we need to direct it towards what are the issues behind that. There's probably a lot going on in their mind that they can't even make sense of. And it's up to the parent. It's very difficult for the parent to not get defensive, not to get hurt, but we need to understand, just as you would if you're in an attack family, almost like a toddler having a temper tantrum, and I hate you and this and that. That's really crushing, but just understand where it's coming from. It's coming from a place of hurt. Doesn't make it okay, but you need to have a qualified individual working with you. And in some cases, I know I've even been there myself, the child might just not want to talk about it right now.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it too real, and that's okay too. But they also are not capable at the time, their minds are not capable of understanding how important and valuable this is for long-term effects. Everyone wants to go towards pleasure and away from pain, and I understand talking about it and being in this uncomfortable situation, talking to a stranger. Not many of us like to do that. So to expect a child to want to do it happily is crazy. And I think we need to be grateful our child is expressing anger and those emotions, because I know in some cases I've seen where the children seem to be okay. And I know a therapist friend of mine said, that's whom I'd watch out for, because if they're not expressing it, it's going to come out somewhere, whether in terms of self-harm, suicidal ideations, or later when you're not around them all the time. And that's scarier than if they're expressing those emotions.
Mm-hmm. Do you find, when you're talking to these parents, like, are a lot of them, telling you stories of when the other parent takes the kid to another counselor, and they say, well, here I am talking to you and I'd like to bring my child to you, but the other parent is already taking the child to another counselor, and they come out and say that the child has said that that parent is reading court documents, court orders with the psychologist, and this eventually gets brought out in court, but it just doesn't matter.
Right. Well, two things about that. Honestly, if I were ever to find out, either personally or with people I'm working with, it, there was a therapist working with a child who had shared court documents with them, I would cease that relationship, and I would also report them to their governing body. That is one of the worst things that you could do. There should be no reason whatsoever to be sharing any court documents unless they're of an age. There was one case where they were, I think it was 16 and 15, and the only reason portion of the court document was shared, but through the parent coordinator, was how it pertained to them in terms of scheduling, and also to explain to them why these decisions were made based on the alienated behaviors of the father.
Mhm.
However, to do all that, that is placing them in a position of being an adult, and that just confuses them, and it's of no value to them whatsoever and damages them. So, but I think to back up a bit, what a person needs to do, and what we often do here in Canada, is when you're building your parenting plan, you built in literally everything, and especially how taking your child to a psychologist will take place. That it and by law up here, the counselors or therapists or psychologists have to get consent from both parents. So you can't just willy-nilly decide whom to take. You take your child to whomever. You have to both agree, and if you can't, then you go to a mediator or a parent coordinator to have it arbitrated to decide whom you take your child to. And then you also, when you speak with the, unless it's court ordered, but even at that, you still have to follow. You can't just decide whatever you want. And any therapist that if they're following their ethics and the code of ethics, they would not accept a child without both. There was one case that I was involved in where the therapist took the child on. Father took it without the parent. The agreement was in place, so both father and mother had to agree, discuss, sign. The therapist, for whatever reason, did not seek permission from the other parent. She said, I thought she wasn't involved in the situation, and she was at fault. And she was in danger of having a complaint made against her governing body, and the other parents ceased the relationship with the child and the therapist, because that's totally improper. And to carve out half of the family and carve out the other parent who should be known, should know about this. Turns out the conversation all revolved around the child being angry at the mother, and essentially each session was coming out as a bash session against the mother and trying to reinforce these ideas. So that's not helpful at all. That was helpful for the father, but not for the child.
Mm-hmm. So when they say, well, we're going to family counseling and only one parent shows up with the kids, well, I know you said you only counsel adults, but would that counselor then call the other parent and say, they're here with the child, where are you?
Yeah, depending on if it's court ordered or not, which in many cases this would be, I would hope that when it's court ordered, what I'm not seeing a lot of is what you're exactly asking. What does a parent or a therapist do in that case? And there needs to be direction in that case. So if does the parent and the child, do they continue? Is the therapist allowed to continue? It depends on what the agreement is. And a lot of psychologists I see will have a contract at the beginning both parents sign, and will outline that. So if it's court ordered, one parent doesn't show up, this is what we'll do, and it's up to the discretion of the psychologist. Some may decide, say it's the father and the child there, they will continue whether the mother shows up or not, but we'll follow up with the mother. But also note that that's important, and the court, in my opinion, needs to be aware of that, and there needs to be more of that accountability, so that nothing has to be proven. It's just shown, and there has to be accountability on the court's part to follow up and to create sanctions if that's the case, but also for the parent to explain why. Because so many times the onus is on parents trying to get their children back, and we have to prove this and prove that, but there isn't a whole lot of expectation for parents to explain why they're not following these court orders or behaving appropriately, and that needs to happen more.
Right. And constantly, a lot of parents are being dragged back into court because the other parent isn't following even the court order. And it gets to the point where it's frivolous litigation.
Right.
And have you ever been called into court to testify on anything that a parent has?
In my agreements, I state that I can't be, because I don't have the capacity. I'm not a therapist. In some cases, therapists can be called to court. I'm sure courts, the power that they have, if they wanted to subpoena me, they could. But no, I typically would prefer not to, but also there should be no need for me to. It's simply, my role is not to make decisions on custody. It's not to make decisions on who's a better parent. It's simply to prepare them for the divorce, get them through the divorce, and also do what's right for their child. By no means am I qualified to say that this parent is, should have parenting time or not. By no means would it. And so there would be no need, in my opinion, for a court to ever call me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I mean, that would take a lot of stress off of you. I
Yes.
think your job would be very stressful as it is. When you get a new parent in that's been, as we've talked, gutted by the family court system.
I was thinking about that, and you think it would be stressful, but it's quite the opposite. Um, Maybe it's because I've been through it, and one would think if you've been through it, you can really empathize. And I think that's where my value comes in too. Is I get it, but I've been very careful. I've had to do my own healing, and if I
Mhm.
didn't, perhaps I would become more married into what's going on. But I find it. I find it empowering. I don't find it stressful. I would find it stressful to not be able to help, to sit on the sidelines and not help. But and I know I can't guarantee any change whatsoever. I can't guarantee results. I can't guarantee solutions. All I can do is help people and guide them through what is the best option for them. And I've said many times before, it's like a tornado warning, and where a tornado warning doesn't stop it from coming, but it just warns you to protect your house. So when you come back up from the basement, at least there's some semblance of life left, right? You can mitigate those damages. And that's all I try and do, but also to validate, because so many parents that go through this, lawyers don't seem to get it, or don't take the time to get it. Judges don't. A lot of therapists do, and psychologists, but someone that's been through it, that understands the deep recesses of what you're feeling, and how, to me, it's close to being, to me, I think the worst thing in the world would be to have your child die. But this is similar in a sense. And I remember going through my own personal experience that I thought to myself, how could a child dying feel worse than this? Like, you're mourning a child who's still alive. And it was the most horrendous. I can never to this day quite articulate how it feels. And to still be in the same town, or to be able to go to a function of theirs and not have that rapport. I used to watch parents, and I used to feel this weird sense of envy and think, how lucky that you get to bring your son home from hockey and I don't right now, because I'm not doing what pleases my ex-husband, and
Mhm.
I'm not doing what he wants me to do, and he's punishing me for it. And it just was gut-wrenching.
Mhm.
And it's like anything, when people say I know how you feel, you really don't until you've been through it. And I think that's part of the value. And I find less stressful, because I know, plus I think, I'm hoping that people can see too, that this doesn't have to end your life. This doesn't have to define you. It sounds so cliche, but it's true. Your children eventually would move out of your home and have a life of their own. So you can't lose sight of yourself, as traumatizing as that is. You have to focus on some of it, even through the process. You need to focus some on yourself, because for many people people I've worked with, as well as myself, if you just focus on the trauma of it, it takes so much longer to dig yourself out, and there could be years lost. So that's another focus that I work on with people, because that's so vital, and it's not selfish at all. It's very selfless to do that, because then you have nothing left for your children if you don't ground yourself.
Right. And I'm sure you discuss coping skills. Do you think when parents stay real busy, because I've heard, if you stay real busy, that's also bad. That can be harmful to you as well.
That's an interesting point, and that is the natural tendency. People think, with anything, grieving or anything, just stay busy so you don't have to think about it. What I've grown to learn is, in many cases, that can work. In some cases, you just need that reprieve. But overall, it is a bad thing, because then you don't process the feelings. You don't even determine what is really going on for you. So, and all that's, keeping busy is fear-based as well. Our natural tendency when we're fearful is to run away. But what research shows, the best thing to do is to run towards it. And it's painful and it's gut-wrenching. The last thing you want to do some days is think about it. But what I find through experience and research is to sit with it. And it's horrible. But it's like anything. Anxiety is based on that too, where you start avoiding things, the anxiety and the fear and the trauma around it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what happens when you stay busy. It's good to keep moving, because sometimes it's hard to get off the couch in some cases, and you have to force yourself, but you need to work through those feelings. Otherwise, one thing I can guarantee is they will come back up and rear their ugly head later. If you don't stop to think about it, your body at some point may break down,
Mhm.
or your mind will, and it will force you. Your body will sometimes force you to deal with it, and it won't be at the best time, and it may be debilitating. So it's best to deal with it as it comes along.
Have you had parents tell you, they get home from work and they just wanted to sleep all the time,
Hmm. Yeah.
and oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. You know what? That's natural. I think
Yeah.
it's anyone who's going through a trauma, and people wonder why, though. It's especially even if there's a calm, like, sure, you're not seeing your child, but there's a calm. And I know many people have experienced, as awful as it is not seeing your children, sometimes that's easier than the few times you do get to see them, because that's very, very taxing. So they wonder, well, I don't have a physical job. Why am I so tired? But as we know, the mental anguish, like, so much is going on behind the scenes that you're not aware. And especially when you're trying to keep busy, trying to push it away, that is so mentally taxing. It's no wonder when you come home, that's all you want to do is sleep. Plus, it's shutting yourself off from everything that you're having to deal with day in, day out, because there's never really, when you're in a situation like this, you're either getting bombarded by emails and texts, or your child, or you're trying to fight for your child, trying to even fight with your lawyer that something needs to be done. And you try so many things and you keep getting no or stonewalled. Sometimes you just want to just check out, and I can understand wanting to sleep. And that's a normal thing until it can be counterproductive, of course, then too. Sometimes your body just needs that rest, and people need to determine, with someone they're working with too, like, why is that happening? Because sometimes you do just need to be in restorative behavior like that, just to kind of give your mind a break. And but it goes on too long, then there's something needs to be done, obviously.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, like some parents, maybe have had, say, 3 years of family court if they're lucky, you know what I'm saying? But, what do you tell them if they're coming to you exhausted and they said they're still sleeping and they can't see their kids and there was no justification to have them taken away?
Mhm.
And, do you tell them to maybe see a psychiatrist? Do you, offer that avenue?
Well, yeah, I'd be surprised if up until that point they weren't seeing somebody, and I would definitely see somebody, because um, they need to, in my opinion, two things: deal with the trauma of it all, and trauma that you need to see somebody that specializes in trauma, because in and of itself, the alienation and the whole aspect of fighting, it's a weird concept to think you have to fight strangers to see something to do something that's natural, to have a relationship with your child. I know none of us would have ever anticipated ever having our child taken away from us. It's still, some days I can't wrap my head around that concept, that it's such a common phenomenon in this world, and the incongruency of it. And you have to have someone help you through that, but also work through some of your triggers, because what I'm finding too is we're constantly reacting,
Mhm.
and some things we don't necessarily need to react to, you know and so I would suggest working with the counselor on that too, and looking at your triggers, and looking at what your attachment was like as a child, and where are some of these reactions coming from. Not everything requires a reaction, not everything requires, so, and that's not going to prevent or even fix the alienation, but to restore some of your own mental balance. But I think you can't wait until 3 years. I think it would be advisable for people to, from the get-go, because you need to figure out now, what do I do now, restructuring my life,
Mhm.
and to do it on your own, to think, even if it's an amicable divorce, it's a huge mind. It is the top of the stress scale, having a divorce. So to think you can go about this alone, I don't
Yeah.
know if anyone's strong enough to do that, right?
Right, right. Well, the thing is, if a parent seeks out, say, a psychiatrist who puts them on an anti-anxiety and antidepressant, even a mood stabilizer, somehow, the opposing or the judge will say, "Are you on anything?" And
Right,
that's where that silver bullet comes out and you lose your kids.
right. And so, and I have an issue with that too. I don't know why we would be punishing somebody for seeking help. It's especially if the reason why they're like this is because of the situation they had no control over with it. It's a ludicrous to create a situation for somebody, and their brain and their mind has a normal reaction. They seek help for that, and then they're penalized for that. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I haven't experienced that here in Canada, but I have in other experiences. I have a few colleagues who have had issues in the past, received medical help, been on antidepressants. Now insurance companies will not give them insurance because they deem them to be a risk. and as I'm sure that's how the courts feel, is now you're a risk because you're, whereas I feel the opposite. In fact, they have been smart enough to seek help. They are being helped, therefore they're less of a risk. And it's like anything else. We need to start seeing mental health just in the same field as physical health. And not only that, I don't quite understand why it would be imperative for the judge to know something is confidential. I mean, you have HIPAA laws and things, right? Why they would need to be made aware of something as personal as medication. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
would it be necessary for them to know if you're on high blood pressure medication or anything else? I don't know if, or even if a person has a mental disorder and they're, let's say, schizophrenic or something else and they're on drugs, I don't know necessarily if the judge needs to know that just for information purposes, but then to penalize a parent to assume because they have a mental condition and they're getting treatment for it that they are not a valid parent or a safe parent, I don't think that's fair at all. That needs to be looked at for sure. And it sounds like that happens quite a bit in the States.
Right. The false allegations, I'm sure you've talked to parents about that.
Yeah.
Is there a high incidence of false accusations, allegations in Canada when you talk to these and counsel these parents?
Yeah, in a way, I wish there was, because then that would mean these kids aren't being damaged by the actual behavior. But to there always are, right? But to me, I liken it to, in Canada at least, to rape and other things. Sure, there's always a small portion of people that will make false allegations, and I know that's where the brigade of people who are against labeling things as parental alienation come from, because oftentimes they say abusers will use that term
Mhm.
against a parent who's trying to protect them from the abuser. But from my experience, it's quite the opposite, that the alienation is occurring, the behavior. And what I get concerned about people assuming these are all false allegations, is it minimizes the scenarios that it actually does occur. But my issue with the false allegations is it should be an issue if there is a way to actually determine if that's going on. We don't know when someone makes an allegation, whether it's false or not, whether it's criminal or whether it's in family law. But to my knowledge, in criminal law, we don't just say, oh, well, someone's made an allegation, they must be guilty. They investigate, such as they should with parental alienation. If allegations are made of whatever, whether it's abuse or alienating behaviors, there needs to be a mechanism, a proper screening tool or what have you in the States, in Canada, to actually investigate, because we can't assume that, oh, they're just false. We also can't assume it's actually happening. We need to investigate to determine what needs to happen. And I'm stunned at the amount of stories I hear, especially from the States, of allegations being made and decisions being made, but so harshly, where the parent is cut out of the children's life and they are further villainized by saying you cannot contact your child, and then if you do contact your child, the police will be called. I don't understand that kind of witch hunt.
I don't either.
Right?
I really
Like
don't.
even if the person was abusive, there needs to be help. Like that person needs to seek help. But to further villainize is, I think, is so damaging to the children and is a form of brainwashing, really. And the courts, in my opinion, if they're ruling in that fashion without any plan for a method of continuing the bond between the parent and the child, or if the parent is able to get to help for the abuse. In some cases, it's not safe for the child to be, and I'm not talking about true abuse cases, but for a parent, in many cases where there are false allegations made, they weren't really proven, and then to be 100% ripped from the children's lives, I just think, nothing that parent could have done is worse than what that judge did by making that ruling.
Mhm.
That's who's at fault by making that ruling, and 100% guaranteed has damaged that children now. And that can, as one of your previous guests, Dr. Mark Roseman, had said, there's intergenerational trauma based on that. That could last 6 generations. And, here in Canada, we've had issues with many years ago with the residential schooling with the Indigenous, and we're finally now turning our minds to how damaging that was for those Indigenous, and how it created a ton of trauma. And we're still seeing it. So we need to look at that and think, unless we want to destroy
Mhm.
generations of children, we need to get on this now.
Right, because that in turn is gonna create more divorces in the future
Right.
and more damaged people. And, some of these people won't seek help. These kids that have come through, that have been, brainwashed and gone through this, they may not even seek help because they don't feel like there was anything wrong with what the other
100%.
parent was saying, you know?
Right.
And what do you think, like when the child turns 18, the parent reaches out, uh, you know, how often should the parent reach out to try to get their attention to say, hey, I've got my side of the story. Do you want to hear
Yeah.
it? Do you want to talk?
Yeah, that's a tough one too, because I don't think, I know there's groups out there that work, and that's not my specialty in terms of reuniting families. However, I've gone through it personally in that my husband was alienated severely from when his child was 7, and he actually, fortunately enough, a year ago came back into our lives. Um, and there's so much based on that there's so much pressure, I think, for the child, but also for the parent. And my heart bleeds for these parents because they're so grateful to have the child back in their lives. But then you also have the sorrow of all the years missing. Plus, let's be honest, whether it's your child or not, you don't know this human being,
Right.
and the child doesn't know you. And the tendency for parents is to just jump in because even if a child was abducted, let's say, and that child, and you still have thoughts of when they were a child. And there can be that tendency for parents to do a ton of reminiscing and pull out the photo albums and do you remember this and do you remember that? It's very healing for parents, right? And for children, I can understand why we think that would be good, but sometimes that's too much of a rush of things, and I think, that's where a counselor has to guide this process too, because the tendency too is for parents to say, do you want to know my side of the story? Because many of us don't inform our children. We don't, and that's tough too, because they're hearing all these lies and they don't hear our side of the story. And so it's easy for them to believe the one side, but sometimes it's not beneficial for them to know everything. And I haven't found a guidebook yet as to determine what you should tell them, what you shouldn't. How I feel though is, above all else, that what that child needs to know is that you have always loved them. You wish you could have contacted them, but you were prevented from doing that. If you want to, give them the gifts that you meant to send, or you tried to send them and that were returned. We had that happen.
Mm-hmm.
But also just start getting to know them as who they are, and maybe not at first try and recoup the past or even inform them of what happened. You're both here and now. Let's try and get to know each other now and forge this new relationship. You can deal with all the other stuff later. And
Mm-hmm.
I know, because we want to just kind of fix it all and get our truth out, but that's not necessarily always the best thing. And I think, and it may feel phony. I know in our personal experience, it felt so strange. People would ask, have you talked about it? Because you want answers too, and it always seems to be like sort of tiptoeing around it. But I think to a certain extent, that's why you have to do healing. Because if you don't do the healing and don't look at your triggers and everything else, you won't be able to listen to your gut, because part of it is that you've got to go back to being a parent, like when your child was little, and there's no guidebook. You do what you feel is right. And if that means to tell them I love you every time you talk to them, I know some people are against that, then you do, right? But also to eventually get to know each other enough so that you can have that open relationship, so that the child can say, you know what, mom, dad, right now, I know you love me, but I can't keep hearing it because it's too tough or whatever. But that takes time. But I feel like kids need to know, because there's a lot of guilt they have because they feel like they were complicit in this, right? I guess technically, but really they're children. They were forced into this. There's a lot of guilt, and there's a lot of incongruency for them, where they think, but this parent's so good to me now, and I was so horrible to them, and there's a ton of guilt. But the parent needs to, if you talk about all that at first, that just throws them into that. And I think they just need to understand this is a safe place. There's no resentment from that parent. This is good. And then you can eventually, hopefully with a therapist's help, work through all those feelings
Mm-hmm.
together, and separately, but together as well.
If a parent came to you today and they say have gone through family court, but then they were hauled back into it a couple years later, what advice, I mean, now they're back into the trauma and reliving everything. What is your best advice for that parent?
Well, I think more importantly, I guess some of my advice would be based on what they should do in handling the court, because I think that's where a lot of the problems stem from, is that we assume what is right will be done and the right decisions will be made and people will see what's best, right? And they'll think like us. Wrong assumption. So that would be, but the most important advice would be to do whatever it takes. And we would talk about how they survived the first round,
Hmm.
because what I don't want people to feel is, and I know so many feel that, we're like, so they're in the process again. They start to feel the same feelings as before and the despair. I don't want them to think, oh, I had made so much progress and now I'm back at square one again.
Hmm.
No, we need to revisit and kind of almost put it into perspective. As terrible as this is, in the whole scheme of things, you did repair a little bit. No, maybe not the relationship between your child and you, but you were able to repair so that you could create a life in between the two court dates, let's say. So you need to put that in perspective and say, okay, try to get yourself to the point of going into your rational mind or your wise mind versus your emotional, to rationalize this out, that we've been through this before and you remember how traumatic it was, but that you still were able to have a life afterwards. The same thing will happen here. To not place so much importance on the end result, because we can't control that. It's, I'm going to control what I can control.
Hmm.
And then I will work through what I have to and deal with emotions. But this time you'll be better at it because you've already been through it once and you've already know what you have to do to heal. You need to remind yourself of that and do that from the get-go, as opposed to waiting till the end of it. Other than that, court is court. Nobody's going to make that easier. But what you need to do is kind of shore yourself up for that, and not, and learn from the first time around, not from the mistakes, but learn what calmed you down and kept you calm.
Hmm.
And that to me is more important than anything. It doesn't matter if you're going to court or doing a presentation or anything else. It's the whole, if it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. That's cliche too, but we have to put things in perspective, that unless it's life or death, even though it's relationships and it's your children, we need to put it more perspective and not let our minds and our emotional mind get the better of us, because then we will react a certain way in court, and it always shoots us in the foot. You know, we're seen as irrational, and I think there's some validity to showing some emotions so we don't seem cold, and there should be validity to the emotions, but not so emotional that we're erratic and we can't make decisions and we can't communicate properly.
Hmm. It's just difficult. It's just difficult for everyone involved. And, but you've been doing this for quite some time, and, you're invaluable for helping people.
Well, thank you.
How can people reach you if they have any questions?
They can email me directly at trish@trishguise.com, or they can visit my website. It's at trishguise.com, and reach me that way as well, and we can chat.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, would you like to be a return guest one of these days?
Sure, would love to. I've very much enjoyed this. And I think
Okay.
the more we talk about this, the better, because I found when I first started, even my own personal experience, I thought I was alone. And there's so much shame involved in this. And, you think, my God, what are people going to think, that I don't have my children with me? They're going to think I'm a horrible person. And the more we talk about it, the more we normalize that, the more people will speak out and we can band together. There's no shame involved in that whatsoever. It's not our fault. We need to talk about it. So anytime, I'd be more than happy to return.
Okay, that would be great. Okay, well, Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in the family courtrooms that in turn perpetuate parental alienation. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. And join us again, and I will have Trish back on. And if you want to write me some questions to ask her, that would be great, or you can contact her as well. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne.